welcome, fellow horror hounds, and welcome to the latest episode of Talk and Stalk, your unholy home for horror. I'm your host, as always, Barry, and today's podcast is going to be me talking about and ranking my top 5 horror movies of 1981. Now, very recently, I did my top 5 of 1980. This again was very hard to do. There are about 9 million honourable mentions for this list. 81 was the year of the slasher. There has never been a year that comes anywhere close to 1981 for slasher movies. There's going to be a few honourable mentions here. Unfortunately, there are some slasher movies that I love from the golden age that were very close to getting into my top 5, but didn't quite make it. As I said, as always, this is my personal list, and this was very hard to do. Very hard, in fact. To put some of these slasher films just above another one feels like I'm almost discrediting the other film. I'm not, but this just comes down to my personal preferences. So some of the honourable mentions here. As I said, this was a fantastic year for slasher movies. So some honourable mentions for me would be The Burning, The Funhouse, of course, directed by Tobe Hooper. Another honourable mention, a supernatural horror film called Ghost Story as well. Another slasher film that certainly deserves a mention would be The Prowler, aka Rosemary's Killer. These are all films that were very close to getting in my top 5, but didn't quite make it. Now, there's two other films. There's two other films here that, again, these are slasher movies I really like, and they were very close to getting in my top 5, but just didn't quite make it. And that is Halloween 2 and Friday the 13th Part 2. Yeah, this is how hard it was. So basically, starting off in the 5th spot now for me would be The Beyond, directed by the one and only Lucio Fulci. This is my favourite Lucio Fulci movie. I love the surrealistic quality that this film has. To me, this is his best film, in my opinion. And just to quickly say as well, House by the Cemetery, released in the same year by Lucio Fulci, is an honourable mention as well. Wouldn't get in my top 5, sorry, but it's still a film I really like from 81. So yeah, The Beyond, Lucio Fulci, one of the godfathers of gore. I think this has some of his most memorable set pieces of any of his movies. As I said, a very surrealistic quality to this film. And why I'm putting this film above some of the other honourable mentions is that while I'm a huge slasher movie fan, this is a film that's very much different. This is a film that really kind of, like with some of Fulci's films, they really kind of stand out from the crowd. They might be a little non-linear and all that, and it may be a little disjointed, a little confusing for most audiences. I mean, I don't completely and fully understand all of Fulci's stuff, but I think it's quite the experience with this movie. Some truly memorable set pieces in this film, and as I said, my favourite Fulci film. Now, in 4th spot here is the only slasher movie from 81 that actually makes my top 5. And this might be controversial. I think this is a slasher movie that does certainly have a big fan base, but that is My Bloody Valentine. That's right. I actually put this above Halloween 2 and Friday the 13th Part 2. Don't hate me for it. I love them slasher films. This was just too tough to do. My Bloody Valentine is my favourite slasher movie from that year. I love the setting for the movie. A unique looking, albeit cool / creepy killer in the minor. This has some great kills. Now, don't get me wrong, some of the other slasher films that I mentioned before have some great kills, The Prowler being a notable example. The Prowler has some of Tom Savini's best work to date. But My Bloody Valentine is a slasher movie I've always had a soft spot for. And I'm not going to lie, Halloween 2 and Friday the 13th Part 2 were really jostling for that 5th spot. And if you were to ask me in a few months' time what my top 5 would be, there's a chance they could etch into it. They were very, very close to being in that top 5, certainly. But My Bloody Valentine, yeah, some great kills. It is one of my favorite slasher movies of all time. I think it's one of the very best from the golden age. And it's really good to see that this film does have a big fan following. So, yeah, that is the only slasher movie that actually makes my top 5 of 81. But even the likes of, I didn't mention these, but even the likes of Hell Night and Happy Birthday to Me are slasher films that I like. But again, not my top 5. But yeah. So in 3rd spot now is a werewolf movie directed by Joe Dante. This is one of my personal favorite werewolf movies. 81 was, I'm not going to go too much into it because we've still got some films to mention, but The Howling is one of my favorite werewolf movies of all time. I think what this film did was boast some great practical effects, courtesy of Rob Bottin, obviously a student of Rick Baker, a man that needs no introduction to anyone that's a horror fan or a film fan in general. I think what I love about The Howling is it's a film that it manages to be effectively scary in places, if you will. But it's a film that certainly kind of, in a way, very wryly kind of pokes fun. It certainly has, plenty of kind of references and Easter eggs. It's a film that manages to really inject humor into the genre without being an outright comedy. I do think it does have a great werewolf transformation scene. Not to compare it to another film, but it's also a film that, as well, that it kind of has a slasher element to it. This is a werewolf movie, but it very much kind of has the formula of a slasher movie, almost. I know it's had about 9 million sequels. I'll admit, I've only seen a couple of the sequels and all that, and I think this film is actually getting a remake, but surprise, surprise. But The Howling is, I think, a very good werewolf movie. But yeah, and again, 3rd spot for 1981. Now, there were 2 films jostling for the top spot here. This film was very close to being number 1. Very, very close. This is a movie I love. It's very much a cult horror film. It needs no introduction whatsoever. The Evil Dead. Again, if you ask me in a few months' time, this could be in the top spot. Who knows? The Evil Dead, to me, is kind of cult horror at its finest. Sam, of course, directed by Sam Raimi, coming out of film school, very little money to work with, and he just wanted to make the best horror film that he could, and it was quite the accomplishment. This is a cult horror film. It's very schlocky, it's very low budget and all that, but to me, that's what really adds to this film's charm. I love this movie, and I'll never forget watching it for the first time. And I just want to quickly get back to The Howling. The Howling is a film that really put Joe Dante on the map. In fact, it's The Howling that really secured his job for directing Gremlins, which is a great horror comedy, a film that I really like. But of course, produced by Spielberg, a man that needs no introduction. But yeah, with The Evil Dead, it's a classic. And obviously, some other films in that franchise that I might be covering, in future podcasts. Obviously it gave us Bruce Campbell. He didn't obviously become the big horror icon, the big horror star really until Evil Dead 2, Dead by Dawn, which technically speaking, not a sequel, more a reimagining, a reboot, if you will. But yeah, I think The Evil Dead's just great, low budget horror. It's not a comedy, but because of its cheesiness and all that, it can be seen as unintentionally hilarious and all that. But this film is just a roller coaster ride. I absolutely love it. So the number 1 spot. Now, this is a film, as I said, this is the movie that was really jostling with The Evil Dead for the top spot. This is a film I covered quite recently on my channel, and this is An American Werewolf in London. which is probably my all-time favorite werewolf movie. I really do have a soft spot for this film. This is the first. This may be the first horror film I ever saw as a kid. The werewolf transformation scene absolutely terrified the hell out of me as a child, deservedly winning Rick Baker an Oscar. And that's what's interesting. This and The Howling came out in the same year. Now, Wolfen is another werewolf film that was released in '81, which I'll admit, I'll confess, I haven't seen. I probably need to. I've actually heard it's a good film, but I haven't seen it. An American Werewolf London, I just think, is a great horror movie, but at the same time, it's a film that really manages to inject humor into the proceedings, again, like The Howling, without being a comedy. I think this film has, still to this day, probably the greatest werewolf transformation scene ever put to film. I love the whole kind of fish out of water scenario in American, in London. The slaughtered lamb pub. Whenever I go into a pub, I always think, like a pub middle of nowhere and out in the countryside. I always just picture the slaughtered lamb. And America, I love the music in this film as well. The fact that every song in this movie has Moon in the title. I just think this is a great horror movie, directed by John Landis, who unfortunately, without going too much into it, to me, this is probably his best film, and I know it's his personal favourite. His career never probably fully recovered after a tragic incident involving a film released in '83. We won't go into it, but this is just a great horror movie, great practical effects. It's a film that manages to be, even now, the transformation scene is very raw, it's very visceral. As I said, I really like The Howlings, which is done in darkness. It's kind of a great mood, a great setting. But with An American Werewolf in London, they show it all in its glory, in pure light. And it's just fantastic. So American Werewolf in London is my top spot, with The Evil Dead very, very close behind it. And as I said, I apologize to anyone that's a huge slasher fan out there. I'm a massive slasher movie fan. And some of these slasher films were kind of etching to get in there. If this was a top 10, quite a few of them slasher films I mentioned would, without a doubt, definitely be in my top 10. So that's pretty much it for today. And thanks a lot to everyone that listened. And I'll be back again soon with 1982's films. And I'll be back again to haunt you and torment you. Take care.